Welcome to The Point of View. This is your favorite current affairs show. Here on YouTube, we have a special show for you. We're looking at the Bank of Ghana in the eye of the storm. Serious state of their financials. Over 80 billion printed in 2021-2022. Losses of almost 50 billion. Now, who caused some? How do we get out? My guest, Seth, Terkper, former Minister of Finance, Dr. John Kwakye, who's the head of economics at IEA, and Dr. Theo Acheampong. I'm sure you like this show, so please share the video and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. So welcome back. Tonight on The Point of View, we'll look at the state of the Central Bank of Ghana. They released their annual report a few weeks ago, and it's really shocking the kinds of things that have been revealed in that report. For example, money was printed to the tune of 35 billion cedis in 2021, to the tune of 42 billion the year after, total almost 70 billion. Lots of concerns about violations of Act 918-2016, which is deficit financing beyond 5% of previous year's revenue. The domestic debt exchange also led to a write-off of a debt of about 48 billion. There are fiscal overruns and debt distresses that the finance ministry undertook. The central bank, in one of their responses, made reference to this. Then there's also a few other issues around their expenditures. So there are concerns about $250 million being spent to build a head office, amount of money spent on domestic travel, bank supervision expenses, director's remuneration, a lot of concern. We're going to break all of this down for you with three very erudite guests. So I have first Dr. Theo Acheampong, who's an economist and also a policy risk analyst. He's joining us from his base in the United Kingdom. Dr. Acheampong, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening, Bernard. Good to be here.
Fantastic. I also have here in Ghana who's the man who's in charge of the economics aspects of the IEA's work, Dr. John Kwakye. Doc, thanks for joining us. Good evening. Doc is on. I'm sure we'll hear him when he sorts out some of the mic issues. We also have Seth Terkper, who is a former Minister of Finance, who incidentally had written about this a couple of years ago, warning that fiscal dominance could ruin the central bank's position. He's joining us from Washington. Mr. Terkper, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation to join the panel.
Wonderful. I wanted to start with Theo, because in the course of discussions on this, we've seen a number of stories. There's a story that Reuters put out today suggesting that central banks all over the world were struggling. I just wanted to highlight a couple of paragraphs of that story and then ask you whether, to contextualize this for us globally, whether the Central Bank of Ghana's challenge is part of a bigger global challenge or whether this is self-imposed. Indeed, the story today reads, among other things, that most central banks have taken a beating and that conservative estimates say it will take 2 years for them to recover from the losses they made. In fact, some estimates say it will take between 3 to 5 years for these central banks to recover. We also know that in neighboring countries like, for example, Nigeria, their central bank governor is under the cosh for some policy actions. Inflation as well is gone through the roof in that country. And there are many, many other issues. So Theo, maybe let's start from you from a global perspective. Without going into the details of the Ghana situation, is there a global challenge with central banks?
Yes, absolutely. And it's tempting not to go into the Ghana situation, but let me paint a picture to our viewers of what's happening sort of globally. So we're in what we call in economics, broadly speaking, a stagflationary environment. So you've got high inflation and relatively low growth. And if you look at the inflation picture globally, this has been one of the biggest inflation we've seen in the last 40 years or 4 decades. And what that does when you have that, inflation is to put a lot of heavy strain on your typical, central banks across the world. This inflation started right after we started easing the restrictions during the pandemic. And then, of course, we had Russia invading Ukraine. And in the aftermath of these two events, particularly the Russia-Ukraine event, what we saw central banks do is to tighten monetary policy. In other words, what they did was to raise interest rates. So again, if you go back, the last 10 or so years, we've had almost zero interest rates by most of the big global central banks. But currently, we're talking about 5 or so percent. And just about a year ago, in June or even in May, the US Fed rate was just around 1%. Currently, we're talking 5.5%. The European Central Bank in September of last year, their rate was 1.25%, the policy rate. We're now talking 4.25%. Same with the Bank of England, where it was 1.25% in June of last year, and now we're talking 5.25%, all outside their broad target of keeping inflation within about 2% for the running of their economy. So that is the big global picture in terms of the inflation. And then the other effect that we've also seen globally really is that because of this inflationary spike, many global banks have also had to burn off some of their reserves to protect and to support their national currencies. Again, particularly the dollar, which has been resurgent. So you see that you tend to get a lot of these portfolio outflows or the investment. Certainly, part of that is the case in Ghana. I'm sure Seth, Uncle Seth, and Dr. John would speak a lot about the Ghana situation. But that is how things have played out at the global level, where you've seen major policy tightening from almost 0% policy rate in the last decade now to about 5%. And as a result, you've also had central banks burning reserves to prop up their currency, particularly against the dollar. And again, maybe just to wrap up, there's actually an interesting article again that was written 3 days ago in the Financial Times, and it makes a strong argument about how bonds across the board are no longer even the so-called safe option for investment because of some of these headwinds that we're experiencing.
Theo, is this a developed economy phenomenon, or is this global in terms of the hike in interest rates, the high inflation, and the resort to reserves to try and shore up expenses? Is this something that's happening in all countries, or is this more US, UK kind of thing?
Well, I think we've seen it happening across the board. So even in Africa, we've seen a lot of the reserve banks from South Africa to Kenya, and of course, certainly in Ghana, having to hike up their policy rates, recently in Nigeria as well. The other thing really is the inflation argument, where again, with that, you have a bit more of a nuanced story, because some of the countries have faced inflation in a slightly different dimension than others. But on the policy rate hike and the global inflation environment, I would argue that it's something that cuts across both developed and emerging markets.
All right, let me come to Dr. Kwakye and Dr. Acheampong. I'll come back to you. So, Dr. John Kwakye, yes, globally, central banks are struggling. But when you look at the Bank of Ghana report and some of the numbers we are told, 35 billion cedis printed 2021, 42 billion 2022, and we're told that this is a clear violation of Act 918 because this is obviously more than 5% of previous year's expenditure, write-off for 48 billion debt based on DDE. Will global developments justify the kinds of situation we're seeing with our own central bank, or do we need to go deeper into the nuances of what they've done to get a clearer picture of the situation?
Yeah, okay. I hope you can hear me. My internet sometimes is...
You are loud and clear. You are loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, let me just add a little bit to what Dr. Theo said about the global context. I think that we have experienced two major global shocks. The first one was COVID, okay? And what COVID brought about was a slowdown in the world economy everywhere. So now central banks responded by providing some stimulus to their economies to support what governments were also doing. So that was the first response. They had to inject a lot more liquidity into the economies in order to help the economies recover. Okay. Then we also experienced, we've been experiencing this, the effects of Ukraine, Russia war. Now that has brought about mostly, high cost of commodities and so on, and the high inflation. And the response from central bank has to be, in fact, to roll back, in other words, to tighten policies rather, which is, in other words, opposite to what the response they had to provide for the COVID. But especially because of the COVID, they injected a lot of liquidity into the various economies, and that also somehow helped to exert pressure on prices and also contributed to the high inflation. And the difference between developed countries and developing countries is that, the especially Bank of Ghana, the injection of liquidity into the economy. Other banks will normally do it, through their monetary policy, framework. In other words, support their commercial banks. That's how they inject liquidity into the system. Instead of lending directly to their governments, you see, because as central bankers, one thing we always learn is that financing the government deficit is the most inflationary thing to do. And that is why the Central Bank Act, all of them, they set limits, regarding lending to government, because we know that it is the most expansionary source of inflation. So we try to avoid that. Now, what has happened in our case is that it looks like, Bank of Ghana went far beyond the ceiling in this act, 5% of last year's revenue. In fact, I know about what happened in 2021, what happened in 2022. In other words, the limit is 5% of 2021's revenue, which was about 70 billion. And that it takes you to just 3.5 billion Ghana cedis. But we are told that they lent almost 44 or 45 billion Ghana. So that is really the magnitude. And once you do that, you're already getting yourself into, serious work, because anything that happens, and we have seen through the debt exchange, that now you have become so much exposed to government. And now they come in with this debt restructuring. And then somehow, because you have gone under an ECF program, the IMF also forces the central bank to be part of the debt exchange, program. In fact, I also have a problem there. Why would the IMF force our central bank to be part of the debt exchange program just because they want us to meet the requirement for the ECF? So that is one. So on hindsight, the Bank of Ghana overlent, to government. And then you bring in this so-called domestic debt exchange program to qualify us for the IMF program, and the IMF compels Bank of Ghana to be part of it. So as Bank of Ghana has explained, out of the 60.8 billion, loss that they have declared for 2022, as much as 53.1 is coming directly from the domestic debt exchange program. So the question is, will you fault them for that? We can fault them for overlending to government. I think that is a problem, But why they are being forced to be part of the debt exchange program is also another. That one, you can't fault them for that, because that has to be agreement between them and then government. We going for that program, and maybe Parliament was also part of it. So I think that is where we need to draw the line.
My next question to you, before I come to Mr. Terkper, is what I find baffling is that at the same time that they were lending directly to the government, financing the budget, they were raising interest rates in an attempt to fight inflation, which arguably they created themselves. If you follow me, because at the time we were discussing this, we felt that inflation was a cost issue, that they were importing inflation from the currency issue. But it's now been revealed that it was their lending that was leading to the inflation, and yet they were raising the rates at the same time. I mean, am I missing something here, or is it possible that you can be creating a problem and trying to solve it yourself that way?
No, you are right on the spot. I mean, they are over lending to government also created, demand pressures in the economy. And I'm sure that as a central bank, they were aware, but they've come out to say that they had to bail out, government, because government was in a serious financial crisis, you see. And if they had not done that, they said they had to do that to save the whole economy from possible collapse. They said if they hadn't provided all that financial accommodation to government, we would probably not have had the lights on, no water, maybe government workers would not even have been paid, or we will have fuel queues all over the place. So they are telling us that is the situation that they found themselves in. And therefore, they had to choose that option. Of course, as you said, they must have been aware that by injecting so much liquidity into the economy, they were going to, cause inflation, and then also a currency depreciation. And then they will have to turn around to increase the policy rate, to respond to that, which will also hurt the long-term, the growth of the economy, So they had to make decide between these two, choices, and they said they opted for the inflationary and the currency depreciation option, as against, as they said, bringing the whole economy to a possible collapse.
Okay, I will leave it there. I'll come back to you as to whether you buy that reason they gave. But let me come to Mr. Terkper. Mr. Terkper, I know you are an accountant and a former finance minister, but I didn't know you also had prophetic powers. Because on June 3, 2020, you wrote an article titled Reversal of BOG Stance on Budget Deficit Financing. It was a long, dense article, but you sort of started pointing to a certain appetite for the central bank to finance the deficit of government through direct injection. Then on October 26, you wrote another article that raised concern about BOG's deficit financing. I mean, particularly June 3, 2020, that's a while back. What did you see in June 2020 that made you write that first article, which eventually has been proven true?
It was in the budget. It was in the analysis of the budget numbers. Because in 2020, first of all, in 2019, in the Article 4, IMF Article 4, the IMF adjusted our deficit. It adjusted our debt numbers. And with all the bailout costs and others that were being put as footnotes, the IMF adjusted and increased our deficit. Then fast forward, 2020, when you look at, the financing, of the budget, you could see clearly. And as in 2022, between 2019 and 2022, you saw a very activist, central bank. To give you an example, at one point, the central bank advanced about 40 billion as financing. Some of this is also obvious because of offsets that were being made, but I don't really want to go into that now. The Deficit was 37. Bank of Ghana financing was 44 billion, or about 40 billion thereabouts. So what is it that Bank of Ghana was financing? You only had to look at the numbers, and know that Bank of Ghana was financing the numbers. Now, let me say also that, and this is the point of education, but to the credit of the governors, if you remember, let me cite 2 incidents. The deputy governor, one of them went to Legon, delivered a speech, and raised concerns about the extent to which the budget, the deficit, was, pushing, the bank, into financing because government could not raise the necessary financing. The governor himself, at the annual bankers ball, I believe it was in 2020, either 2020 or 2021, the end of year, raised serious concerns, about the extent to which, the the bank was being pushed, to finance the budget. We had been arguing about set-offs. We have been arguing about expenditure being put, outside the budget as footnotes, expenditure being spent, around, gift miss off budget, as we call them. And then in 2021, what prompted the 2022 comment was that if you look at the 2021, budget review report that was published by the government itself, which was to have been done annually, but wasn't being done, a whopping 77 billion Ghana cedis was owing as contracts awarded and in the pipeline, as well as arrears. Out of these, 23 billion was paid. And leaving about 50 billion, 53 or so, billion. Yet the budget was showing, paltry amounts, and adjustments was made to about 14 billion. So if you take the financing of the budget and you look at the numbers, the huge numbers that were emerging, you would see clearly that Bank of Ghana was doing the heavy lifting. And let me remind you that between 2019 and 2020, going into 2021, if you want to blame external factors, you should also look at the flows that came in for those external factors. About 6 billion in plus before we stopped going, to the bond market, 2 billion, about 8 billion flowed into this economy on account of COVID. I don't want to enumerate them, from IMF SDR, through IMF COVID loan, if you remember. So the question then began, the nagging question is, if with all these flows, and remember that this is a country that had used, less than $1 billion to do corrections, from drought to global financial crisis to all those. So the external factor is important, but against these heavy flows that came in, IMF, World Bank, AFDB, and others, development partners, for us, to use to manage COVID, how come we were still relying on central bank? In fact, in many countries, in fact, for the COVID loan, the government had to go to the IMF. Again, that was another, alarm bell. Had to go to the IMF to get a waiver, for the money to come into the budget, rather than, as we normally do when we get money from the IMF, use it to support, the central bank. So whilst the central bank was hemorrhaging, funds that should go, particularly from the IMF, the ECF 2015, part of it was used for the budget. The COVID loan entirely was used to support the budget. And then SDR, it appeared in financing that part of it was going to go.
So if I get you right, you're saying that
so in essence,
there was no point in the central bank, in addition to all these inflows, to also directly finance the budget, because there was about 8 billion of inflows from different sources. That's what you're saying.
Yes, and in essence, it showed you that there was a big hole in the budget, which was disclosed in Article 4, 2021, at about 3 to 5 billion. In fact, we had said that we needed 3 billion, for COVID by the time we did a COVID loan. So I'm saying that the issues we are discussing, as Dr. Kwakye pointed out, has also to do with the deficit. Deficit financing means that the government is not able to cover its, expenditures, and revenues are stagnant, and that's also showing. If you draw the graphs graphically, you will see them.
I just want to be clear. So should the culpability lie with the people creating the deficit, i.e., the fiscal side, the finance people, or should it go to the people who chose to finance the deficit by printing money, the monetary people?
Well, against the law. So the culpability is on both sides. And Bernard, recall, by the way, if you talk about deficit, the deficit is revenue minus expenditure. And the amount that is needed less amortization to finance the deficit. And this is what Parliament approves as the Appropriation Act. If you recall, there was a move to have the governor come to Parliament to explain against the law, right? And you remember that long thesis that was written about the independence, of the central bank by their lawyers and how it wouldn't be prudent for them to go to Parliament. That is not independence. That is accountability. And we know, we're just talking about the globe. We are just talking about, even the Fed chairman goes to Senate to explain himself. The Fed chairman goes to Congress to explain himself. You can bear with me that the central bank governor, in the UK goes, to Parliament to explain himself. So we should separate accountability, from. So that is where BOG would have had, the cover to explain what they are now explaining to us with some of us by virtue of having held certain positions and worked in ERP and the rest, we're able to.
All right.
So I'm afraid we cannot also, just my quick point, if we look at external factors, let us remember that part of the interest rate increases are attributable to post-COVID recovery, no downturn. If you take the US, it is attributed to the fact that there is a fear, that the economy, was overheating, right? And therefore, if nothing was done against it, and that's how the central bank started raising interest rates to reduce it. So I don't think we should be, I said earlier that some time ago that it was complacent at first to always be citing what is happening outside.
Thank you. We'll come back to all of this. We are talking to two economists and accountants. Seth Terkper, former finance minister, Dr. Theo Acheampong, economist and risk analyst, and of course, Dr. John Kwakye. We're trying to understand the state of the central bank. Losses made in the billions of cedis, debt rating of the money they lend to the government can't pay because of DDEP. There's also concerns about their expenditures, 250 billion on a head office, lots of money spent on travel and car repairs. State of the central bank is actually in a state of disrepair. How do we resolve this? Stay with us, we'll be right back.
Finally, anyone can become a house owner.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You Go Flip, a real estate gaming platform that allows you to play and stand a chance of winning a house or cash or consolidated values, such as savings towards a house. Simple and easy to play. Visit www.yougoflip.com. Buy a ticket to enter the game. Wait for the end of the game to enjoy the win. Anyone can win. Flip it or own it. You Go Flip. This advertisement has been vetted and approved by the Gaming Commission of Ghana. Play responsibly, not for persons below 18 years, and gaming can be addictive.
Many people think I get whatever I want because I'm a popular actress. But no, that is not true. Me Ankasano, Adie bia me ye bia no, me shishimpe papa no. And when I find it, I stick to it. My shishimenya Bell Pack tissues. Bell Pack ewe tea roll. Bell Pack tea roll. Soft but not weak. Strong but not hard. It is smooth. Me yusua me hot tummy. It's just perfect. Same as the kitchen towel. What's about what? What's me the papaye? What's me soaky? Echimu esa pepa. One Bell Pack kitchen towel lasts longer and saves you money. It's time you switch to Bell Pack today. Say your pocket tissue, table napkin, tea roll, and a kitchen towel. Bell Pack is simply the best. It's just perfect.
Nothing feels so good like Bell Pack.
Welcome back. Tonight we're trying to understand the state of the central bank, the reports released on them, their annual report which shows the state of their financials is not very healthy. Now my guests are Dr. Theo Acheampong, Dr. John Kwakye, and Mr. Terkper. Now Theo, let me come back to you. The IMF's comment this week is a bit baffling to me. So in one breath, they have sought to back the central bank's 60 billion CD loss, right? The fund said in the release that the impairment which was brought on by the government's domestic debt exchange was, quote, necessary to restore macro stability and public sustainability, right? End of quote. But in the same statement, they said, tame inflation because the 60 billion loss is not an excuse to shirk your mandate. So they cautioned the Bank of Ghana against not fulfilling its policy mandate in the face of this loss posted, and that despite the loss, the central bank must ensure that inflation returns to the target band of 8%. I mean, you know what inflation is. I'm not sure if it's double speak or I'm the one who's not understanding what they are trying to say. Is there not some sort of trying to equalize or something in this statement from the IMF?
Yeah, I think it's deliberately worded so to, in my view, confuse us, because at the end of the day, like Seth and like John, Dr. John have enumerated, the problem with the inflation that we've seen, particularly last year, is because of the deficit financing. That is the key issue, right? So in one breath, you're saying that tame inflation, which in fact is the core mandate, right, of the central bank. You look at the act, and the first thing is that they have to maintain price stability. And then in another sense, the same central bank is the one printing and providing all these overdrafts and other monies to finance the big hole that the government has created, even beyond what originally they themselves said they would be appropriating as of the mid-year budget last year. So that statement, for me, one, is contradictory. Number two, it is confusing. But importantly also, I think the central bank has also not been candid with Ghanaians throughout the process. If you recall, Bernard, last year, a number of analysts and people, including even the opposition for all we care, the likes of Adongo and others, have been raising issues about how the central bank has been conducting its operations, especially when it comes to the deficit financing. And we were here when Bank of Ghana issued statements, public statements, to the fact that they basically denied something like this, had happened. And here we are down the line, and the written fish is out there for us or to see. So I think they've got to take a part of the blame. As much as there are global factors, in our case, if you look at the issues much more critically, there is the deficit financing argument that we've all talked about. But there's also the issue really about the mandate of the central bank and whatever they did within the remit of the law, the act that sets them up. And having gone beyond that amount and what they provided, beyond the 5% revenue target, I think that we've got to have a serious public or parliamentary inquiry on this. I hear in the UK, sometimes you turn on the news and you have the Bank of England governor. He's facing parliamentary select committees. He's being grilled over policy decisions. Same thing in many other places. So what is it about our central bank and the governors that they cannot come to parliament and report to the people of Ghana about some of the pressures that the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, and other people are putting on them to finance that gap. As where I sit, for me, I think they've lost a core part of their operational independence, and it's not just me. Even the IMF, in their own report, talks about that. They talk about the dominance of fiscal policy to the extent that all of the financing and the extra money and the overdraft is the one that is driving the inflation that we're seeing in the country at the moment. And that is what we've got to address.
So,
The IMF statement you just quoted, like I indicated, for me, it's confusing. And number two, really, it serves no purpose because it doesn't really address the root cause.
so when the central bank says they had to finance the deficit to save the country from collapse, when they went from 3.5 billion, the legal mandate, to 40 billion last year, and they said that this was to keep the lights on and to prevent petrol queues. Do you buy that?
I don't buy that argument. So which collapse? By which indicators, right? And you also ask yourself,
6
at
billion.
the end of the day, now who caused them, right? Because again, let's look at things a bit more carefully. Up until about maybe August, September, if you look at even the media budget and the line items there, the deficit was going to be about 38 billion. Out of that, the central bank was only going to provide 8 or so billion out of that. In the original budget that was read in November of 2021, there was zero in there for Bank of Ghana financing, right? So between September till about the end of the year, the number jumps up astronomically. Now, the argument the central bank now makes is that, oh, there was a run on the CD and they had to burn reserves and they had to, basically prop up, and there were bills piling that they had to pay on behalf of the government because they had lost access to the market and all of that. But we were here and we've been talking about the government having to cut some of its expenditure and live within its means before all of these issues came about. Number two, when the central bank also says that they did this to save the economy, you ask yourself, at whose expense? If you look at the data, inflation now is in excess of 40-something%. The bank's core mandate is to fight inflation. Their own target was originally to do this between 6 to 10%, and it was revised to 18.9%. Now we're still talking 40-something%. So when you say you did this to save the economy, who did you do it for? Is it for ordinary Ghanaians? I don't buy that argument. I think it would have been done to save some portion of the economy, maybe some investors, and to pay some bills. But there were trade-offs, and the trade-off is that we've seen inflation high up and Ghanaians being impoverished and their livelihoods, taking a hit.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Kwakye, your background is interesting for this discussion because I know that in your previous life, you worked as an assistant director at the Bank of Ghana previously. You've advised the executive director of the IMF in your previous life. You've also been on the MPC. So the only thing you've not been is finance minister. So almost all the people in this thing, you've done the Bank of Ghana, you've done IMF, and you've done Bank of Ghana on 2 levels. Do you understand what IMF is saying? Because I read your statement and it seemed as if they were on one hand saying that the loss is not the BOG's fault, but then they're also saying that despite the loss, do your work, tame inflation. It seems very interesting. Theo says it's just deliberately confusing. You worked with them in the past, so maybe you understand what they are trying to say. What is the IMF trying to say here?
Well, the IMF, they are a very diplomatic kind of institution. When they enter into a program with you, and what they try not to do is to, go too far into the past. I mean, you see, so they want to be more forward-looking. They know, if you read the program documents, that both the government and the Bank of Ghana have not done the right things in the past. In fact, that's why we've come to this crisis, together with some of the external factors. But they would rather not go too far into the past. So they are looking forward. And in other words, they are saying that Bank of Ghana has already exposed itself so much to government. Okay, what do we do about it going forward? Instead of just allotting the blame, they said, let's look forward. And so they bring in this debt exchange, program, which, again, surprisingly to me, they are insisting that it should be a requirement, a prerequisite, for them approving the program, for you to get into some kind of debt sustainability. So that is what they are saying. In other words, the Bank of Ghana has been exposed already to government. They say, what do we do about that? And then they insist that it should be part of the debt exchange program. They know that it will impair the balance sheet of the Bank of Ghana. We all know that. We all cautioned against it, but they think that there's no other way, because they want to insist that you reach some kind of debt sustainability. Again, Ben, I think the issue, you raised an issue of who is to blame. I think I wanted to comment on that. I think the blame for all this should be put at various levels. First, the government, by causing all these fiscal deficits, which of course required, some financing, and then they didn't get it all from the normal sources. They had to restore to Bank of Ghana. We have been calling for government to try and live within its means, forever. Collect your revenues, cut your expenditure. It's not only this government. Previous governments, have done similar things. Now the central bank also, if government is being reckless in its finances, and you are also supposed to protect us. That is why we have placed limits on your lending to government, in your act. So to go beyond that, especially in a very excessive way, if we're talking about 2022, you were supposed to lend only 3.5 billion Ghana cedis. Now, if you had lent 10, we probably will not be talking about, but when we hear about 45, then there's a problem. There's the issue also of whether you sought the necessary parliamentary approval, or did you also notify Parliament as the law requires? That has not also been resolved. Then we also come to Parliament. I mean, parliamentary oversight. I think Theo, also was referring to that. Without even the budget itself, the Appropriations Act, is always exceeded, breached, and nobody is, sanctioned for it. And then you come to the Bank of Ghana also. I think the oversight of Parliament over Bank of Ghana, there's also a gap there. And I think that the law, the problem is with the law. But nothing stops Parliament in other countries. I mean, US Congress, even the private sector people, if you are Google or whoever, and you are doing something that is not proper, they will call you to Parliament. So, I mean, for a public institution like Bank of Ghana, what stops Parliament from calling the governor, or the governors or the management to account for their actions from time to time? So they are also partly to blame. And then finally, I think we have to come back to the Bank of Ghana law, the Bank of Ghana Act, and look at all those loopholes, as the lawyers, the lacunas, and then try to plug them, so that we make the bank, as we are trying to make them independent as much. We all want the bank to be as independent as possible, but they must also be accountable. So we have to try and marry the two. Otherwise, the bank is too independent, and it's also not sufficiently accountable. Meanwhile, we allow the minister, the treasury also to be able to get in there and then influence the bank, because they appoint them. But even if you are appointed, you are given the independence. Why don't you assert your independence? I mean, it's the same in other countries. The president appoints the chief justice. He appoints the electoral commissioner. He appoints the governor. the same in other countries. But once you are appointed, you are given your autonomy and you must accept it. So that's also an issue which has to be dealt with.
Thank you. I'll take another break. When I come back, Seth, I have a couple of questions for you about the operational independence of the central bank and what must be done to address the matter. This is the point of view. We're looking at the Bank of Ghana and the state of their credibility, to be honest with you, looking at the serious nature of the financials released a month or a few weeks ago. Stay with us.
Whatever the occasion, with ATL, you can never be out of style. ATL, bringing fabric to life.
With Global, you order anything you want, and when you receive it, you celebrate it with your whole body. Because when that tasty grilled chicken is here, the weekend starts. The ingredients for your favorite recipe just in time. And when the cake arrives, the party is on. Because receiving anything on Global deserves a dance. Download the app, order anything you want, and track it minute by minute until it arrives. Global. Order anything, we deliver in minutes.
Welcome back. So, point of view tonight is looking at the Bank of Ghana and in the eye of the storm, very, very troubling numbers in terms of losses they've made. And mind you, inflation, which is supposed to be controlled by the central bank, it started rising. We're in the third straight month of inflation rise, about 43%. Interest rates are also above 30. And the major mandate of the central bank, which is maintaining price stability, is gone. Mr. Terkper, I wanted your insights into how a finance minister and a governor relate, because I think being finance minister, you have a working relationship with the governor, but we also understand there's supposed to be independence, as the other two panelists have said. So how does it work? Because, for example, in controlling inflation, there's the monetary side and the fiscal side. So do you compare notes? I'm asking this because a lot of people feel like the governor could have resisted the urge to finance the deficit, although we know that this problem was caused by the fiscal dominance. What's your comment on how that relationship should work and whether they are equals in terms of power relations?
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I come to that, let me just chip in and say that let us remember in the ECF 2015 that the IMF required that the Mahama administration, against the background of Doomsday, against the background of Singapore, against the background of falling crude oil prices, we did the budget with $99 and prices fell to 35, insisted that we should do zero financing in spite of the law. And we did zero financing. So I think we should, yes, I understand the diplomacy and everything. So I asked myself, is it the same fund, right? And it's Ghana and I program or not, and I program. Wow. So that I just wanted to chip in, that there's a precedent for the fund insisting that we do zero, which was done in 2016 in an election year, and against the background of falling crude oil price, and as I said. Now
no, but on that point, hold on that point.
Yes.
In 2016, we were under a program, but when this financing was done, 21, 22, we hadn't yet gone on the program.
No, it was, we entered into the program we started the negotiations in 2015, entered the program in 2015. Prior to that, we had done homegrown policy, which we ourselves imposed so that we should remain within the 5%. And indeed, Bernard, if you recall, there was a stormy discussion in Akosombo when the Bank of Ghana Act was being discussed. And the issue back then, by then we were in the program, was whether we should put zero financing in the act or not. And it took, to his credit, Honorable Kotose and a few others, Dr. Sibe, on the opposition side, the current government, to argue that it was impossible for a developing country, to do zero financing, even the 5%. And that's how come the 5% was done. But instead of 5% of current revenue, which is unpredictable, the change was made to 5% of prior year expenditure, which is what Dr. Kwakye, mentioned. So we were definitely in an IMF program.
So you are saying that now, in 2016, there was zero financing by central bank of government deficit. That's the point you're making.
Yes, there was. And in fact, the rate of the growth of debt decelerated. It didn't accelerate, and that's because we had done the treasury single accounts, we had done, the book building, we had removed the government bonds, which is now the subject of DDE, from the central bank to the stock exchange, and it had become tradable, and therefore it eased some of the pressure for government to refinance. And then remember, we had also set up the sinking fund, to pay down, our debt, out of which we used 350 million to pay the first sovereign bond under President Kufuor, which President Kufuor, His Excellency, issued. We left 250 in the kitty, and the current administration used 200 million of the difference on October 4th, 2017 to pay off the balance. So, we used our own petroleum revenue in the sinking fund of 550 million, to pay down, the Kufuor bond, and we would have expected that this would continue. Remember that during COVID, the 250 million that was taken for COVID was our own money, US dollars. Remember, it was taken from the stabilization fund. That's also money which we had left. Part of the bonds that we did, we had actually used it for seed capital for Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund. So we had all these structural programs which were not a funding position.
So have these things been continued by your successors?
We wouldn't be where we are today, honestly, with 3 oil fields if it had been continued.
So back to the
we had been right.
Fair enough. So back to the
original. Sorry.
So back to the original question.
Yes, I've said that to the original question, there is a formal engagement and an informal one. The formal one, there are 3 formal ones. The Deputy Minister for Finance is one of them is always on the board of the central bank. And I was on the board, as a deputy when the late His Excellency Kwakye, was a governor. So that is one of the input is there. Dr. Kwakye can also bear me out in relation to Bank of Ghana that I was permitted even when I was a minister. Because normally you would send your the officials to go and present the fiscal situation as input to the MPC. I was permitted to attend those meetings. I made a request, first of all, as a deputy, as a minister, but you wouldn't sit in for the decision to respect the autonomy. But for presentation of the technical discussions and interaction, this is something which I always did out of respect for the MPC and for economy. Now, higher up, the governor and the minister are both members of the EMT. And so some of the issues we are discussing here should emerge. And Kwakye's EMT, he had been governor. I've been on the board. So we discussed a lot of, monitoring and the interface with the fiscal. So that is one. Now, on the technical level, there is what we call the EPCC, the Economic Policy Coordination Committee, which is made up of the minister or his deputy and the governor or his deputy always chaired. And the heads of all monetary and financial institutions, not the private ones, attended. Statistical Service is there, Ministry of Finance is there, Bank of Ghana is there, NDPC, all the institutions that matter. And that is a technical committee that discusses issues and raises them up, to the ENT, for its decisions and cabinet. And so there is, yes, formal. And the informal one, which we constituted between myself and Mr. Wampa was, for, of course, they have a canteen. Minister of Finance didn't have one. So we arrange for every month to have an interaction, to have lunch and to have interaction instead of waiting, for these formal, committees. And we normally discuss, the minister, deputies, and then the governors in a very informal, atmosphere. Under an IMF, there's the last one. Under an IMF program, there is a memorandum that is signed between the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Ghana on, deficit financing, which is not to be exceeded. And so being an IMF program, you can see that there is the limit on financing, and the memorandum, as I believe, has also been signed.
Thank you for talking to us, Honorable Seth Terkper, former Minister of Finance, Dr. John Kwakye, who's the head of economic policy at IEA, and Dr. Theo Acheampong, who's an economist and a policy risk analyst. So who's to blame? The government, the bank, Parliament, and of course, those who are duty bearers within those spaces. Thanks for watching tonight's edition of The Point of View. We'll be looking at the Bank of Ghana at the eye of the storm. Hope you've learned something new. We'll be with you next time. Stay with City TV. Good night.
The Point of View is brought to you by Bellpack. Bellpack, just perfect.